I had been planning this solo camping trip for almost 3 months because I desperately needed a break from work and the constant noise of the city. My destination was a remote section of the Rocky Mountains that hardly anyone visited after summer ended. The weather forecast promised cool nights, light winds, and clear skies for the entire weekend. I packed my truck with everything I thought I could possibly need, including extra food, emergency supplies, and enough firewood to last several nights. My family thought I was crazy for going alone, but I had always found peace in places where nobody else wanted to be. The farther I drove into the mountains, the weaker my phone signal became until it disappeared completely. Instead of worrying, I smiled because that silence was exactly what I had been searching for. The narrow dirt road twisted through endless pine trees that seemed to swallow every bit of sunlight around me. Even during the afternoon, the forest looked strangely dark, as if the mountain refused to let daylight reach the ground. Looking back now, that should have been the first sign that I never should have camped there. I reached the trailhead just before sunset and noticed something that immediately felt unusual. There were no other vehicles parked anywhere nearby, even though it was the perfect weekend for camping. The parking area looked abandoned, with faded signs covered in moss and weeds growing through the cracked pavement. I stepped out of my truck and was greeted by a silence so complete that it almost made my ears ring. Usually, forests are filled with birds, insects, or at least the sound of wind moving through the trees. That evening, there was nothing except my own breathing and the occasional crunch of gravel beneath my boots. I shrugged it off and told myself I was simply overthinking because I wasn't used to such complete isolation. I shouldered my backpack and began hiking toward the campsite marked on my old topographic map. Every few minutes I had the strange feeling that someone was standing just behind the trees, quietly watching me pass. Whenever I turned around, all I saw were endless rows of pine trunks disappearing into darkness. The campsite sat beside a small mountain lake that reflected the orange glow of the setting sun like polished glass. It was one of the most beautiful places I had ever seen, and for a moment every strange feeling disappeared. I carefully pitched my tent on a flat patch of ground surrounded by tall evergreens. A small stone fire ring suggested that campers had stayed there many years ago, although it looked like nobody had used it recently. I collected dry branches and soon had a warm fire crackling in front of my tent. The smell of burning pine mixed with the cold mountain air created the perfect camping atmosphere. As darkness settled over the valley, thousands of stars appeared overhead, brighter than I had ever seen before. I cooked a simple dinner, leaned back in my camping chair, and listened to the quiet night. Then I realized something that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The forest was still completely silent. Around 9 that night, I heard the first sound that wasn't made by me or the fire. It came from somewhere across the lake where the trees were too thick to see through. At first, it sounded like a single footstep landing on dry leaves. I froze and listened carefully, expecting another camper to appear with a flashlight. Instead, another step echoed through the darkness several seconds later. The footsteps were incredibly slow, almost as if whoever was walking wanted me to notice them. I called out, asking if someone was out there, but nobody answered. The footsteps stopped immediately after my voice echoed across the water. I laughed nervously and convinced myself it had probably been a deer wandering through the woods. Deep down, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever made those footsteps had stopped because it heard me speak. By 10 o'clock, the fire had burned low, and the cold mountain air pushed me into my sleeping bag. I zipped the tent closed and checked the flashlight beside my pillow before turning it off. The darkness inside the tent was complete, making it impossible to see even my own hand in front of my face. I listened to the soft sound of my own breathing as I slowly drifted towards sleep. Just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard a branch snap somewhere outside. Then another branch cracked a little closer to the tent. I held my breath and listened, hoping the sound would fade away. Instead, something slowly circled around my campsite without making another noise. Whatever it was, it moved carefully enough to avoid stepping on dry leaves.
Nearly 20 minutes passed before I finally convinced myself that I had imagined everything. I rolled over and closed my eyes again, trying to ignore the pounding of my heart. That's when I heard 3 slow knocks against the outside of my tent. They weren't loud enough to sound aggressive, but they were deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. Every muscle in my body instantly locked in place. I whispered to myself that it had to be a tree branch moving in the wind, except there wasn't any wind at all. The silence after those knocks felt even worse than the sound itself. Whoever or whatever had touched my tent didn't move away afterward. I grabbed my flashlight and counted to 10 before gathering enough courage to unzip the tent. The beam of light swept across the empty campsite, illuminating my chair, the dying campfire, and the surrounding trees. Everything appeared perfectly normal at first glance. I slowly walked around the tent, expecting to find a curious raccoon or maybe a black bear. Instead, I found a series of fresh footprints pressed deeply into the damp ground. They formed a complete circle around my tent before disappearing into the forest. The strange part was that the prints looked almost human, except they were much longer than an average person's feet. I stared at them for several minutes, unable to decide whether I should leave immediately or pretend everything was fine. Eventually, I convinced myself there had to be some logical explanation. I rebuilt the fire because somehow the flames made me feel less alone. As the flames grew brighter, shadows danced wildly between the trees beyond the campsite. Every moving branch suddenly looked like someone quietly stepping closer. I poured myself a cup of coffee, even though it was nearly midnight, because I knew sleep wasn't coming anytime soon. My flashlight remained in my lap while I stared into the darkness surrounding the lake. Every few minutes I thought I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Whenever I turned my head, there was absolutely nothing there. The forest almost felt alive, as if it was patiently waiting for me to look away again. I had camped alone dozens of times before, but I had never experienced fear like this. A little after midnight, I noticed something standing on the opposite side of the lake. At first, I thought it was another tree because it never moved. Then the clouds drifted away from the moon, and the figure became easier to see. It was unusually tall and impossibly thin, standing perfectly still between 2 pine trees. I couldn't make out a face, but I knew without question that it was looking directly at me. The distance was too great for details, yet every instinct in my body screamed that it wasn't an animal. I blinked several times, hoping it would disappear. Instead, it slowly lifted one arm into the air. Then it stood there without moving another inch. I pointed my flashlight toward the figure, but the beam never seemed to reach it. The moment the light touched the trees across the lake, the figure vanished completely. I searched every inch of the shoreline for several minutes without finding anything unusual. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been nothing more than a dead tree playing tricks on my tired eyes. Just as I lowered the flashlight, I heard a quiet splash from the edge of the lake beside my campsite. The sound came from only a few feet away instead of across the water.
I slowly turned my head toward the shoreline, barely daring to breathe. Something was standing just beyond the reach of the firelight. Before I could focus on it, a low whisper drifted through the darkness and softly said, "Don't turn around." Every instinct in my body told me to run, but my legs refused to move even an inch. The whisper had come from somewhere so close that it sounded like warm breath drifting past my ear. I slowly scanned the shoreline, but the firelight only revealed smooth rocks and gentle waves rolling onto the sand. The voice had sounded calm, almost friendly, which somehow made it even more terrifying. I kept telling myself that someone had to be playing an incredibly cruel joke. The problem was that I hadn't seen another person for miles since leaving the highway that afternoon. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I took one cautious step backward toward my tent. The woods surrounding the lake remained completely still, almost as if the entire mountain was holding its breath. Then another whisper floated across the darkness, softer than before. This time it simply said, "You're late." I hurried back inside the tent and zipped every opening shut as quickly as I could. It was a pointless reaction, because thin nylon fabric would never stop a person or a wild animal. Even so, the tent felt like the only barrier separating me from whatever waited outside. I switched off my flashlight and listened carefully through the darkness. Several long minutes passed without a single sound. My heartbeat slowly settled into a steady rhythm, convincing me that maybe the worst was over. Then I heard slow footsteps circling the tent once again. They weren't heavy like hiking boots or light like animal paws. They sounded almost deliberate, as if each step was placed with incredible care. Whoever was outside wanted me to know they were still there. The footsteps completed one full circle before stopping directly beside my head. I could hear someone breathing through the fabric only inches away from me. It wasn't loud breathing, but slow, patient, and completely steady. I pressed my mouth to keep from making a sound. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours as neither of us moved. Suddenly, the breathing stopped without warning. Before I could relax, one long finger slowly dragged across the outside of the tent from the top to the bottom. The sound of fabric stretching beneath that touch made my entire body shiver. Whatever stood outside wasn't trying to get in. It was making sure I knew exactly where it was. The rest of the night passed in complete silence, but I never closed my eyes. Just before sunrise, birds finally began singing somewhere high in the trees. Their voices instantly made the forest feel alive again. I cautiously stepped outside and expected to find fresh footprints around my campsite. Instead, the ground was completely untouched except for my own tracks from the night before. The strange circle of footprints had disappeared, as if they had never existed. I searched every inch of the campsite for nearly half an hour without finding a single clue. The lake looked peaceful beneath the morning sunlight, making the night's events almost impossible to believe. For a moment, I wondered if exhaustion had caused me to imagine everything. While making breakfast, I noticed an old hiking trail leading farther up the mountain behind my campsite. It wasn't marked on my map, and it looked like it hadn't been maintained for decades. Curiosity got the better of me, despite everything that had happened during the night. I grabbed my backpack, camera, and bear spray before following the narrow path into the forest. The deeper I walked, the colder the air became, even though the sun was climbing higher. Moss covered nearly every rock, and enormous pine trees blocked most of the daylight overhead. About 30 minutes into the hike, I found the remains of an old wooden sign lying across the trail. Only 3 faded words were still readable. They said, "Turn back now."
I laughed uneasily and assumed the sign had been left there by pranksters years ago. Even so, I couldn't ignore the strange feeling growing heavier with every step I took. The trail became narrower until branches scraped both sides of my jacket. There were no fresh footprints anywhere except my own. It was almost impossible to believe nobody had walked this path in years. Then I noticed something carved into one of the trees beside the trail. The carving wasn't a name or a date. It was a rough drawing of a tent beside a lake with dozens of tall figures standing around it. Someone had carved every detail deeply into the bark using a sharp knife. At the bottom was a single sentence that made my stomach tighten. "They only come after sunset." I suddenly realized how quiet the mountain had become again. Even during daylight, there were no birds calling or squirrels running through the trees. The silence felt unnatural, as if every living creature had abandoned this part of the forest. I checked the time and saw it was only early afternoon. Part of me wanted to keep exploring, but another part screamed that I needed to leave immediately. I turned around and began walking back toward the campsite. After only a few minutes, I heard footsteps behind me, matching my pace perfectly. Every time I stopped walking, they stopped too. Every time I started again, they followed. I never found the courage to look over my shoulder. The footsteps continued for nearly 15 minutes before suddenly disappearing. When I finally reached the lake, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. My campsite looked exactly as I'd left it that morning. The fire pit was cold, my tent stood untouched, and my truck keys were still safely inside my backpack. I decided I would pack everything before sunset and drive home instead of spending another night there. As I began rolling up my sleeping bag, something caught my attention near the water's edge. A small pile of smooth stones had been carefully stacked into the shape of a tower. I was absolutely certain it hadn't been there earlier. Resting on top of the stones was my metal camping mug. I walked over to the stone tower with slow, uncertain steps. My mug was spotless, even though I had used it for coffee only an hour before. Beneath it lay a folded piece of yellowed paper protected inside a small glass jar. My hand shook as I opened the jar and unfolded the note. The handwriting looked faded with age, but remained perfectly readable. It contained only one sentence: "If they speak to you twice, never answer." I stared at those words for several minutes, trying to understand what they meant. The paper felt decades old, yet it was completely dry besides sitting beside the lake. I looked around the campsite once more. Someone had left that warning for me. The sun slowly began sinking behind the mountain peaks much earlier than I expected. Long shadows stretched across the lake until nearly every corner of the campsite fell into darkness. I packed as fast as I could, determined to leave before night returned. Just as I lifted my backpack, I heard a familiar voice from somewhere deep within the trees. It wasn't a whisper this time. It sounded exactly like my younger brother calling my name. The problem was that my brother had died 5 years earlier. The voice called again, sounding frightened and desperate. Without thinking, I took one step toward the forest before remembering the warning folded inside the glass jar. I stopped with one foot hanging in the air, my heart pounding so hard it almost drowned out everything else. The voice sounded exactly like my brother, down to the slight crack he always had when he was scared. For one dangerous second, every part of me wanted to believe the impossible. My mind desperately searched for a logical explanation, but none existed.
I slowly reached into my pocket and unfolded the warning again. The words, "If they speak to you twice, never answer," suddenly carried a weight they hadn't before. The voice called my name again, this time sounded much closer than before. It even laughed the way my brother used to after telling a joke. I clenched my teeth, remained completely silent, and forced myself to keep packing. The instant I refused to answer, the forest became deathly quiet once more. I shoved the last of my gear into my backpack and hurried toward the trail leading back to the parking area. The sunlight was fading much faster than it should have, covering the mountain in deep blue shadows. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me between the trees. Every few minutes I caught movement in my peripheral vision, but whenever I turned, there was nothing there. The trail suddenly felt much longer than it had earlier that day. My breathing grew heavier as I climbed the rocky path away from the lake. Then I noticed something that made me stop cold. Fresh footprints appeared in the dirt ahead of me. They hadn't been there when I walked in that afternoon. The footprints were much larger than any hiking boot I'd ever seen. They sunk deeply into the soft ground as though whoever made them was incredibly heavy. The strange part was that they only went in one direction. They weren't leading away from me, they were leading toward me. I followed them with my eyes until they disappeared around a bend in the trail only 50 yards ahead. Every instinct screamed that I should turn around, but going back meant returning to the lake. I tightened my grip on the bear spray and slowly continued forward. The forest remained unnaturally silent as I stepped into the fading evening light. As I rounded the bend, the trail ahead was completely empty. There was no person, no animal, and nothing large enough to leave those massive tracks. I looked back down at the dirt, expecting the footprints to continue. Instead, they simply ended in the middle of the trail. There were no return tracks, no side trails, and no signs that anything had jumped into the trees. It was as though whatever made them had vanished into thin air. A cold breeze finally moved through the forest for the first time since I arrived. The tall pine trees creaked softly above me. Then I heard a voice whisper directly behind my left shoulder. "Don't leave." I spun around so quickly that I nearly fell onto the rocky trail. Nobody stood behind me. The trees stretched endlessly into darkness with nothing moving between them. My flashlight beam bounced wildly across trunks and branches, revealing only empty forest. My hand shook so badly that I almost dropped the flashlight. The whisper sounded so close that I could have sworn someone was standing inches away. I forced myself to keep walking without looking back again. Every step felt heavier than the last. It was as if the mountain itself wanted to keep me there. The trail eventually opened into a small clearing where I immediately recognized the old parking lot. Relief washed over me as I spotted my truck waiting exactly where I had left it. I broke into a jog, eager to leave the mountain behind forever. As I reached the driver's door, something made me freeze. My truck was covered in a thin layer of dust except for one perfectly clean handprint on the driver's window. It was much larger than any human hand. The fingers were unusually long and thin, stretching almost halfway across the glass. I slowly backed away from the truck instead of opening the door. Someone or something had touched it while I was camping. I quickly unlocked the truck using my key fob and climbed inside, slamming the door behind me. The solid sound of the locks engaging made me feel safer than I had in hours. I immediately started the engine, and the familiar rumble brought a small sense of comfort. The headlights illuminated the empty parking lot and the beginning of the dirt road leading down the mountain. I shifted into reverse while checking every mirror. That's when I noticed a tall figure standing perfectly still behind my truck. It hadn't been there even 1 second earlier. The headlights didn't fully reach it, leaving only a dark silhouette. Before I could react, it slowly raised one arm and pointed toward the forest. I slammed the truck into drive and pressed the gas pedal without another thought. Gravel sprayed behind me as the tires fought for traction on the steep dirt road. I refused to look into my mirrors again. The narrow road twisted sharply between towering cliffs and dense forests. My headlights barely reached around each bend before another curve appeared. Every few seconds I expected something to run into the road. My pulse remained painfully fast as I drove deeper into the darkness. Then the truck radio suddenly turned on by itself. A soft voice whispered through the speakers, "You forgot something." I immediately turned the radio off, but it switched itself back on seconds later. This time there was no whisper. Instead, I heard slow breathing coming through the speakers. It sounded exactly like the breathing I'd heard outside my tent the previous night. I pulled the radio fuse from the dashboard, expecting the sound to stop. It didn't. The breathing continued, even though the radio display was completely dark. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Then, very quietly, a familiar voice spoke again. It was my brother. He whispered, "Don't let it see you looking." Before I could process those words, something stepped into the middle of the road about 100 feet ahead. I slammed on the brakes and the truck skidded sideways across loose gravel before coming to a violent stop. The figure stood motionless in the headlights, impossibly tall and unnaturally thin. It had no visible face, only a dark outline that seemed to absorb the light around it. Neither of us moved for several long seconds. The engine idled quietly while my breathing filled the cab. Then the figure slowly tilted what should have been its head. Finally, in a voice that sounded exactly like my own, it smiled and said, "I've been waiting for you to come back." I didn't dare turn around because every instinct I had was screaming that if I looked directly at whatever was sitting behind me, I would never leave that mountain alive. So I kept my eyes fixed on the windshield while pretending that the reflection wasn't there, even though I could clearly see its unnaturally wide smile stretching farther than any human face should allow. And despite the freezing fear crawling through every part of my body, I slowly reached for the ignition with trembling fingers, hoping that if I kept moving and refused to acknowledge its presence, it might lose interest in me. The truck suddenly became so cold that I could see my own breath floating in front of my face, even though it had been relatively warm only moments earlier. A faint smell of damp earth mixed with something rotten gradually filled the cab until it became almost impossible to breathe normally. I could hear slow, steady breathing coming from directly behind my right shoulder, but the breathing wasn't synchronized with mine, making it painfully obvious that something else occupied the small space inside the truck with me. Every few seconds, the reflection behind me appeared slightly closer, even though I never heard it move or felt the truck shift beneath its weight. My hands shook uncontrollably as I forced the truck into reverse, praying the transmission wouldn't fail at the worst possible moment. The tires rolled backward over loose gravel with an agonizingly slow crunch that seemed unbelievably loud in the otherwise silent mountain night. The smiling reflection remained perfectly still for several long seconds before its head slowly tilted in a way that no human neck could possibly bend. Just before the truck began moving, I heard my own voice whisper from the back seat, "You've already let me in." The moment those words echoed through the cab, every electronic system inside the truck went completely haywire as the dashboard lights flashed wildly, the windshield wipers suddenly activated without rain, the headlights pulsed brighter and dimmer in an uneven rhythm, and the heater blasted freezing air through every vent despite being turned completely off, making the entire vehicle feel less like a machine and more like something alive that was slowly losing control of itself while I desperately fought to keep my hands steady on the steering wheel. I refused to glance into the rearview mirror because I was terrified of seeing what might actually be sitting behind me instead of its reflection. My heartbeat pounded so violently against my ribs that it almost drowned out the mechanical chaos surrounding me. Outside, the forest seemed to close in around the narrow road until the trees looked impossibly taller than they had only minutes earlier. Shadows stretched across the gravel in ways that didn't match the direction of my headlights. Every instinct told me that reality itself no longer obeyed the normal rules of the world. Somewhere outside the truck, I heard dozens of slow footsteps moving together with perfect synchronization. None of them sounded hurried. They sounded patient. They sounded certain that eventually I would make a mistake. As I continued reversing down the mountain road, I suddenly noticed dozens of figures standing silently between the pine trees on both sides of the road, and although none of them stepped into the headlights completely, I could clearly make out impossibly tall silhouettes that remained perfectly motionless while facing my truck, creating the horrifying impression that they had been standing there long before I arrived and were simply waiting for darkness to give them permission to reveal themselves. There had to be at least 30 of them. Not a single one moved an inch. They simply watched. Every time the truck bounced over another rock, the headlights briefly shifted, revealing another figure farther back among the trees. Some appeared closer than others, but none attempted to approach me. It felt less like I was escaping a predator and more like I was driving through an audience silently observing the end of a performance. Then, without warning, every silhouette slowly raised one arm at exactly the same time. They all pointed toward the mountain lake where I had camped. The moment the road widened enough for me to spin the truck around, and as soon as I shifted into drive and accelerated downhill, I felt a brief wave of relief wash over me because the silent figures disappeared behind the trees. But that feeling lasted only a few seconds before I noticed that every mile marker along the roadside displayed the exact same number, making it impossible to believe I was actually getting any closer to the highway no matter how fast I drove. I passed the same broken wooden fence 3 separate times. I recognized the same fallen pine tree leaning across a large boulder. Even the cracked warning sign beside the road appeared again and again. My odometer continued climbing normally, but the scenery refused to change. It was as though the mountain had folded the road into a circle that trapped anyone trying to leave after sunset. The realization settled heavily in my chest. I wasn't lost. The mountain wasn't letting me go. Minutes slowly turned into what felt like several exhausting hours, and although the fuel gauge steadily dropped while the engine continued working harder than ever, the landscape outside the forest remained exactly the same, leaving me with the terrifying certainty that I had become trapped inside a place where distance no longer existed in any meaningful way, because every direction eventually led back to the same stretch of silent forest that seemed determined to erase every possibility of escape. My eyes burned from constantly searching the darkness. My shoulders ached from gripping the steering wheel too tightly. Every breath felt colder than the last. Occasionally I caught movement beyond the headlights, but it vanished before I could focus on it. Once I thought I saw dozens of pale faces staring from the branches high above the road. Another time I could have sworn someone was running alongside the truck without making a single sound. I stopped trusting my own senses entirely. The mountain had become a place where nothing I saw could be believed.
Without any warning whatsoever, the truck engine suddenly died in the middle of the road, leaving me surrounded by complete darkness, except for the faint glow of the moon filtering through the thick canopy above. And despite repeatedly turning the key in the ignition until my wrist hurt,
The engine refused to make even the smallest attempt to start, as though something beyond mechanical failure had simply decided that my journey was over and there was no longer any reason for the truck to function. The silence outside felt impossibly heavy. Then came one slow footstep. Another followed several seconds later. Then another. The footsteps approached from every direction at once. They never hurried, they never stumbled. They simply drew closer with terrifying confidence. I locked every door, even though I knew those thin pieces of metal would never protect me from whatever had been following me since the lake. The footsteps finally stopped only a few feet away from the truck, and although I couldn't see anyone outside through the darkness surrounding the vehicle, I gradually became aware of faint breathing coming from every window at once, as if dozens of unseen faces were standing inches from the glass while silently studying me with endless patience, waiting for the exact moment when fear would finally overcome common sense and force me to look directly into their eyes. My heartbeat echoed painfully inside the cab. Sweat ran down my forehead despite the freezing temperature. Every instinct begged me to keep staring straight ahead. Then the truck slowly creaked beneath an incredible weight settling onto the roof. Another weight landed beside it, then another. Soon it sounded as though dozens of people were standing above me without making a single unnecessary movement. A deep cracking sound spread across the windshield before a thin line appeared in the glass directly in front of my face, and although the crack itself was small, it slowly widened with each passing second as if invisible fingers were pressing steadily against the outside of the windshield, making it painfully clear that whatever surrounded the truck had finally decided to stop waiting and begin coming inside instead. I backed away against the driver's seat as far as possible. The crack continued spreading like frozen lightning across the glass. The breathing outside became louder. The truck roof groaned under impossible pressure. Then I heard the same whisper that had greeted me beside the lake. "Don't turn around." This time, however, the whisper came from inside the truck. I squeezed my eyes shut because I knew that if I saw whatever was speaking behind me, I might never recover from it. But even with my eyes closed, I could clearly hear slow movement inside the cab as something carefully shifted from the back seat into the passenger seat beside me before leaning so close that I could feel icy breath against the side of my face, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of wet soil, decaying pine needles, and stagnant water from the lake where this nightmare had first begun. It never touched me. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to crush every remaining piece of courage I had left. My hands had become completely numb. I could no longer tell whether I was breathing or simply shaking. Then, in my own voice, it quietly asked one question. "Do you remember how you got here?" The question echoed through my mind long after the voice stopped speaking, because for the first time since arriving on the mountain, I realized there were enormous gaps in my memory that I couldn't explain, including the strange fact that I couldn't clearly remember driving to the trailhead, pitching my tent, or even choosing this campsite in the first place. And as those missing memories slowly surfaced like fragments rising from deep water, I began seeing flashes of myself standing beside the lake several nights earlier than I believed, speaking to something hidden among the trees, smiling as though I recognized it, and willingly following it into the darkness before waking up inside my tent with no recollection of what had happened, making me wonder whether I had ever truly been alone on that mountain or whether I had unknowingly returned because something there had already claimed me long before this trip officially began. At that exact moment, the truck engine started by itself without the key in the ignition. The headlights switched on, illuminating the empty road ahead. Every sound outside vanished instantly. I slowly opened my eyes. The passenger seat beside me was empty. I drove away without looking back a single time. Even now, years later, I still wake up some nights hearing 3 slow knocks on my bedroom wall, followed by my own voice whispering from somewhere just beyond the darkness, "I'm still waiting for you to come back." If you've made it all the way to the end of this story, thanks for staying with me through the darkness. Stories like this remind us that the scariest things aren't always the ones we can see. Sometimes the real horror is the feeling that something has been watching us long before we ever noticed it. Maybe the mountain was haunted. Maybe exhaustion and isolation played tricks on the mind. Or maybe there are places in this world where we're simply not meant to spend the night. I'll let you decide what really happened. Now I have one question for you. If you heard someone calling your name in the middle of a silent forest, using the voice of someone you lost years ago, would you have answered? Let me know your answer in the comments below. I read as many comments as I can, and I'd love to hear what you think really happened in this story. If you've ever had a strange experience while camping, hiking, or spending the night alone in the wilderness, feel free to share it. Your story might inspire the next video on this channel. If you enjoyed tonight's story and you'd like to hear more slow burn camping horror, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next nightmare. Until next time, keep the fire burning, keep your flashlight close, and if you ever find yourself alone in the mountains after sunset, whatever you hear, whatever calls your name, don't answer. Sleep well, if you can.